happy for the first time on this channel to not be going in depth and discussing someone else's game, but actually to be discussing a game of my own, and that is The Wind Began to Howl. And this is well, I have a full description here. It is a forged in the dark song fiction tabletop role playing game that brings 2 to 3 players together with the iconic ballad All Along the Watchtower to create stories of intimate conspiracy and desperate adventure. So I'm going to break all of that down to describe what exactly this game is. It's a little bit hard to describe because there are aspects of it that are going to be very familiar, especially to viewers of this channel and listeners to Let's Learn Blades in the Dark. But there's also aspects that are going to be quite unfamiliar. Of course, many of you are also familiar with All Along the Watchtower, but maybe haven't encountered it in this exact kind of format. So the three aspects I really want to talk about today are the fact that it's a Forged in the Dark game, the fact that it is a song fiction game, and then finally the art that went into it. So to start out with, we can talk about that Forged in the Dark aspect of it. So let's take a closer look at the text, and I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. So this is about a 21-page game. It's available on itch.io right now. You can just go search for The Wind Began to Howl and pick it up there. And when you look at the intro text to the game, you'll see the verses, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But more importantly, I want to talk a little bit about how the mechanics work right now. So this is, first of all, a game that is like Blades, and that is Forged in the Dark, which is the sort of engine license for Blades in the Dark. But it has a lot of guided post-gen character creation, which is to say, when you play as one of these characters, you play as the Joker or you play as the Thief. You don't, as in Blades, go through a distinct character creation process. You just pick one of the two characters. The stats are already decided for you, and you have fate triggers, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And that's basically it for character creation. Then you jump into your first verse. Each verse forms a different section or different scene within the game. And when you play out a scene, you are going to describe your character in response to these questions that you see here on the screen. So what that does is it allows you to define your character not through a session 0 character creation process, as you might find in most Forged in the Dark games, but rather as you go along. And that's because this game is designed to be played in about an hour. It's very easy to pick up and play, and that's generally how I've run it since creating it and through playtesting. It's just something you can pick up, play for an hour with your friends without doing any preparation, and then have a good time, and wrap it up, and then maybe bring it back in the future. But it's not a campaign game, it's a one-shot game. And the character generation is designed around that concept. So another important fact about the game is that there are 2 to 3 players, but there is no GM. So there's two rules variants that you can play with. The first is if you have 2 players, you see one will take on the role of the Joker and the other will take on the role of the Thief. You will describe the world and the challenges the character face together. If the Joker or the Thief is acting, the other player can play the role of the world and the supporting cast. If both are acting, they work together to describe the other roles. And when a character encounters consequences for a role, their player has the first say in what happens to them. So this is very distinct from Blades in the Dark, where the GM would primarily decide that, and the player would get a say in what happens through the resistance roll. Now, in this game, there is no resistance roll, and it's not because I think the resistance roll is a bad mechanic, but it's because if you remove the GM from the game and make it player-centered and make the players decide the consequences for their own characters, well, they can decide what the degree of consequence they think is appropriate directly. So they don't need to go through a resistance roll. They can just sort of do what they think is right, and what they feel comfortable with. So that resistance roll negotiation process that many Forged in the Dark games have is actually removed here. There is another rule variant where you have a third player who enters in, and this player has some roles that will be familiar as GM roles, but in fact they are distinct from a GM. So one player will take on the additional role of the facilitator. They will facilitate reading and understanding the rules and play the roles of the world and the supporting cast. The facilitator can also make suggestions for position, effect, and consequences of roles. However, the player connected to the character who is rolling has the first say in what happens to their character. So again, even though there is a facilitator in the game, that does not mean that they decide the consequences of roles. That's actually something that the player decides for their own character still. So I've played it both the 2-player way and the 3-player way, and both work perfectly fine. It's really just a matter of how many people you want to have involved in the whole creative process and what works for you. You know, in these COVID lockdown times, everybody's busy going from online meeting to online meeting, and it can be difficult to schedule a larger group. So I find that, you know, maybe the 2-player duet style is easy to get up and go with. Just play an afternoon game or something like that. But I've also had circumstances where, say, one player isn't able to make it to a regular game night session, and then we'll go with the 3-player variant for the remaining players so that we can get a game in an hour, keep up the continuity of the group, but also not have to stress out about switching systems or anything, because this is very easy to pick up and play. Now, a final, or a couple of final points I want to talk about here is, unlike in Blades, we have different stats, and we only have 3 stats for each character. So there are 3 stats in the game. One of them is resources, which represents your material wealth and your connections. You have resolve, which represents your willpower and determination. And you have wits, which represents your cunning. Now, these 3 resources are really designed around the sorts of characters you find in All Along the Watchtower. These are essentially scoundrels of a sort, and you know, we don't have a magic stat because maybe these characters could be interpreted as using magic, but it's not explicitly spelled out, and maybe that would just like fall under their resources. So according to your interpretation of the song, you can kind of just fit whatever's happening into those 3 resources, and it's very easy to track. Finally, there is a mechanic called Fate, which you see up at the top here. And this is basically a sort of substitute for stress, what stress does in Forged in the Dark games. We don't use a normal stress mechanic, we use something simpler and slightly different. So, like stress, you can spend fate on a roll, and this will give you +1d when you're rolling. So if you have resources of 3, but you don't feel safe on the roll, you want to bump that up to 4, you can spend a fate point, and you get an extra die. Now, this resource, this fate resource, is shared between the two PCs. It's not that each PC starts with 2 fate. It's the 2 PCs together have a pool of 2 fate. So it is a shared resource, and that's meant to encourage that sense of intimacy that I mentioned earlier in the game description. You can spend fate, of course, but how do you get it back? Well, each character has a fate trigger. And these are essentially kind of like the keys that you will find in John Harper's earlier game, Lady Blackbird. They are triggers that you as a player can aim to hit, which are going to express something essential about your character. And the Joker's trigger is to take fate when you act with conviction and purpose. Why is that? Well, it's because at the beginning of the song, the Joker says, there must be some kind of way out of here, right? And he's like lamenting his fate. He doesn't know what to do. He's got malaise. And when you as a character overcome that malaise to act with decision, to act with decisiveness, then you take fate because you're working with your inner conflict. Then you have the thief. The thief takes fate when they overcome a problem with wit and cunning. So not really overcoming their personal conflict, but that's just kind of a characteristic of the thief, which is that they are cunning. They can think their way out of the malaise. They can think their way out of the situation. He says, but you and I have been through that, and this is not our fate, right? Like, it's like, we're too good for this. We're too clever for this. And so you get to express that as the thief. All right, so that's how you get fate points back. Finally, there is, of course, the push your luck dimension to the fate pool. So there's a push your luck dimension to stress in Blades in the Dark with the resistance roll, where it's like, oh, I'm going to resist that consequence. I'm going to roll. I'm going to see how many stress I take. Oh, I went over. Okay, I stressed out, and I'm out of the mission. Here, it's a little bit more severe and a little bit less chancy. So essentially, the players have a shared pool, and if the fate pool reaches 0, they fail in their objectives. Now, importantly, you can go down to 0 on your last action, but by the end of it, if you haven't succeeded in your mission, then you have failed. So oftentimes when I find players using the fate pool, the way the pacing works in the game, they tend to generally get down to 1 or 0 fate by the time the mission is over. So it really creates that kind of sense of tension that that you get in the song. And I do think that this as a mechanic is really simple, but it also just like adds to that sense of cooperation, the sense of intimacy, and the sense of adventure. All right, so I've been talking a little bit about the Blades mechanics. The rest of the stuff you will find is pretty familiar. If we go down here to the final verse, you will see there's an engagement roll. There are clocks, which you basically use to set the difficulty of the game. And there is the good old action roll, which is more or less what you would expect from Blades. It's just, again, that the consequences are decided by the relevant player, not by a GM. And you can see the good old controlled, risky, desperate. I just added some nice little pithy comments underneath each of those. So that's the Blades dimension. But I want to talk a little bit more about the song fiction dimension of this game. This more, maybe sort of more original or unusual dimension of it. So you can see here we have the full 4 verses of the song. And as I said, each of these verses represents a section of play. All Along the Watchtower is a ballad, and many ballads I don't think would necessarily be appropriate for a role-playing game because they're too explicit in what they describe. Like there's a story, there's a clear story, and you go from the beginning to the end, and there's not really too much room for you to paint your own scene in there. For example, one of my favorite ballads, one of the greatest ballads of all time, has to be The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Fantastic song, but there's not a lot of room for open interpretation there because we all know what the historical story of the Edmund Fitzgerald was, and the song pretty much recreates it beat by beat. So we don't need to imagine what is going on in the song. We could just think to the context, and it makes sense, and it's very powerful, it's very emotional, but it isn't necessarily what we would want to bring into a role-playing game. All Along the Watchtower, on the other hand, is actually much less explicit in what it's describing, but it's not so vague that you don't have any idea what's happening. It's really in that middle space. And what that allows you as players to do is take the context given by the song and flesh it out with your own vision, your own imagination. And you do that in the verse structure. So there's no world building discussion going into the game. You just go into it. You get started right away. You listen to the song, and then boom, you go to verse 1. So the first section here is to paint the scene. And you just read out these questions. It's like an automated GM that will structure the scene for you, and you just respond to it. So you have the Joker. So this is addressed to the Joker player. What about this place oppresses you? Oh, I don't know. I just know everybody here, and they know all my secrets, and I have no privacy. I've got to find room for myself in this world, and I can't find it in this place. There's an answer. It could be anything. It could be whatever comes to mind, and you just go from there. So the next character, the thief. What makes you better than these people? They've spent so much time studying each other, they don't know a thing about the broader world. And I do. That makes me better than them. And I'm going to prove it. Right? Those are the kinds of things you're going to do in play. So after you go through the paint the scene, every verse, except for the final one, has that. Well, it also paints a scene, but it's a slightly different way. You then move on to these 3 points. The opening, which is just going to actually set the scene, the character entering, some action happening. So, opening, the thief enters the scene surreptitiously. The Joker makes a display of malaise. Right? This is like the Joker saying, there must be some kind of way out of here. There's too much confusion. I can't get no relief. Both players are going to describe how they do these things, and then you move on to the crisis, which is the turning point of the scene. The Joker expresses their feelings to the thief, right? So that gets to that sense of intimacy. It's like, okay, maybe this is an action game, but we actually do a lot of character building by these kinds of intimate moments that build a sense of conspiracy, a sense of working together against your situation. And then finally, you have the question, which is kind of like the decisive turn at the end. Why does the thief let the Joker in on their plan? Maybe they're just useful. Maybe they're rich. Maybe they see something in them that is a shared spirit. I don't know. It's up to you. You get to decide. And you go through each of the verses until you get to the final verse. Here you're going to paint the scene again and then go into an engagement roll. It is quite simplified compared to Blades, but it's very familiar. Essentially, you start with a d6, and you have 3 questions to answer, and then you move on from there. You get a position based on that, and then you decide together how long of a clock you want to go up against. So if you want an easy game, 4 segments. If you want a challenging game, 6 segments. If you want a hard game, 8 segments. And if you want an extremely hard game, 10 segments. Then you just go through, do action rolls, describe what's going on, and according to your effect level on your actions, you're going to get segments towards filling the clock and achieving your goal of overcoming the watchtower. Finally, you get to decide what happens based on whether you succeeded in your goal or whether you failed. There's a question for you either way. And that's the game. That's the game right there. So, you've seen the Blade side of what's going on. You've seen the song fiction side of what's going on. And of course, you've seen the art here on the screen. I just wanted to briefly mention about the art so that it's, well, you just get a little bit of backstage information, I guess, a bit of inside information about what went into the art on this game and what it's all about. Now, the art, the illustrations, the layout, and the music, yes, there is music to go along with this, were created by my friend Lou Quaid. Lou is a Australian artist, and he approached me to work together on a project. And I actually had already written most of this game, but I didn't have an artist. I didn't have a layout person. I said, oh, you're going to be perfect for this. Brought him on, and we started to work together on what the look of the game was going to be. And I went to the abstract expressionist art of Franz Klein. He's an American artist from originally from Pennsylvania, and who did art somewhat like this, based on the coal mining equipment of his hometown. And obviously it doesn't look like a machine, and if you look at Klein's art, it's not clear that it's a machine because it's abstract expressionism, but it's very bold and very machinic in a sense. And I thought that was going to be a good look to go with. The interior art is much more of Lou's own style, especially you see things like this, very characteristic of Lou's art. And I'm very glad to have this in the game. I think it's come together very nicely. Finally, there is the song that goes with the game. If you go to the itch.io page, at the bottom you'll see a link to it on Bandcamp. It is pay what you want, so you can pay however much you want for it, however much you think it's worth. And this is a lo-fi cover of All Along the Watchtower that you've heard here in this video. and which was recorded by Lou on a 4-track mini disc system. So very vintage, very retro. But I think it's a pretty fantastic cover of the song, and it is there in case you want to stream your game and you need something that is copyright free, or you just want to do something original with your session. Of course, you're welcome to use any cover of the song or the Dylan original, but Lou's version is there specifically for use with this game. So I highly encourage you to check that out. All right, so that is essentially a look at The Wind Began to Howl. It's a project I've been working on for about 2 years now. I started when I was living in Kobe. It was inspired by a session of karaoke to actually make a game about All Along the Watchtower. And then this started to happen, and bit by bit it came together, and now it's available on itch. So I encourage you to go check it out there. Thank you for watching. I will have another video up soon about what's going on with the channel. I really appreciate everybody who's subscribed. I've gone over 1,000 subscribers now, and it's been a long journey to get there. But I appreciate all your comments. I appreciate whether you're here for video game Let's Plays or whether you are here for role-playing, tabletop role-playing game content. Thank you for contributing. Thank you for subscribing. And please do check out the game.